great to see so many people here interested in reproducibility. I should start by saying I'm really sorry that Hilda Bastian, who was initially going to speak tonight, can't be with us. Unfortunately, her mother died very suddenly last week, and so she obviously had to cancel. We therefore have rescheduled things slightly so that there's going to be a very brief introduction by me, followed by Fiona Fidler giving the presentation as we had originally planned, and then Chris Chambers is going to say a little bit. But we do also want to leave time for questions. So we will try and squeeze all that into the hour, and then we have half an hour over drinks across the way, when you can discuss things further in more informal circumstances. We do have a hashtag that you see here. If you would want to tweet, that's fine with us. And I also want to thank Alexander Bird, who really has been responsible for making us able to have this meeting in this very fine lecture theatre and looking after also some of our social arrangements. Thank you, Alexander. But let me start by just saying a little bit about why we're calling this meeting. Last October, we started up the UK Reproducibility Network, which is very much Marcus Munafo's baby, if you like, and he may say a little bit about it towards the end, but basically the idea is we're pulling together a lot of different people interested in different aspects of making research more reproducible, and tomorrow we do have our first advisory board meeting, and so we were bringing people from all over the country, and we thought it'd be great to take the opportunity to have an inaugural lecture. So that's the reason why we're all here. I'm chairing this advisory board, although they don't listen to my advice at all, but I have a good excuse for always turning out because I'm somebody who's obviously got a long-standing interest in this. And I thought I'd start by being rather provocative and suggesting something that I've suggested sometimes before in discussions, particularly with Chris, that sometimes you feel that modern science is no better than alchemy, even though we think that we've come a hell of a long way, and we laugh when we look back at the old alchemists doing things in their crazy ways. But actually, a lot of the time, I would argue, the problem is not that the scientific method doesn't work, but that we're not applying it properly, and consequently, we're wasting a lot of time and energy doing research that is actually not showing what we think it ought to be showing. And my famous slide on this topic is this one, where I sort of identify what I regard as the four horsemen of the reproducibility apocalypse, and I'll take you through them, but they are hypothesizing after the results are known, or harking, having low power, p-hacking, and publication bias. And one of the reasons we wanted to have the topic we have today is that what often happens is when you talk about these things, people say, yes, but people have been talking about these things forever and nothing has changed. Why hasn't anything changed? And that's really what we're interested in, is whether things are going to change now, because those of us in the UKRN have a strong sense that things are indeed changing. So what are these things that we need to be concerned about? Well, publication bias is something that has been talked about since at least the mid-1970s, and my guess is that for each of the examples I give, Fiona is going to give a far more scholarly and historically accurate account, but these are the things that I'm aware of, is that in 1975, Greenwald talked about prejudice against the null, social psychologist Anthony Greenwald, and concluded that because people are reluctant to publish null results, so researchers who get null results are reluctant to try and publish them, and if they do, journals will reject them. He did a rather nice model showing how this filters through the system to completely bias the literature, and concluded that the research publication system may be regarded as a device for systematically generating and propagating anecdotal information. Rather severe criticism, and the same problem described as the file draw problem by Rosenthal in 1979. The field that's picked up on this most is clinical trials in medicine, where it's been really recognised just how serious a problem it is if you do drug trials and you only publish the ones that come out with nice results showing that something worked, without realising that for each of those there may be 20 that didn't find something worked. So you end up with this sort of very distorted picture on the basis of which people may be given inappropriate treatment or even die. So I think that when you look at it through the lens of clinical medicine, it's a really serious problem. But in other disciplines, it just means that we're likely to be coming to wrong conclusions. Low power. Jacob Cohen started writing about this in 1969, pointing out that very often research was done in such a way that you were going to have type 2 errors magnified. That is, you were going to be working with sample sizes that were so small that you wouldn't be able to detect a real effect of interest, even if it was there. And although he wrote about this, several volumes of this book, and some people picked up on it, on the whole, in many fields, it is still rather not taken seriously and ignored. In 1987, in the field of medicine, Newcomb said that people are still doing these small studies with little more than a blind hope of showing the desired effect. But in medicine, this has changed, and you will be unlikely to get something past an ethics committee if it's underpowered. But in other fields, there tends to be a view that you don't talk to a statistician about your study, because if you do, they will tell you it's underpowered, and that will be rather sad, and you won't be able to do it. So people almost avoid statisticians because they might tell them that. The other problem that I'm very, very interested in is so-called p-hacking, which is a tendency to sort of not understand about p-values. And I think this is a problem that's endemic without people even realizing it's a problem in many fields. I have various ways of trying to explain it. The simplest is probably using poker, where probability is one of the things that, games of chance are one of the reasons why we understand about probability, because they are very clear in how they work. A hand called a 3 of a kind is a very unusual one, or not a very unusual one, but a moderately unusual one if you just are playing poker and you are dealing at random, chance of 1 in 50. So if I said I'm an amazing magician, I can move the cards, make them behave in a particular way, I hand you a pack of cards and ask you to deal 5, and you get 3 of a kind, you would think, wow, that was amazing, this person really can influence the cards, and you'd be impressed. However, if this person was going through the audience doing this with everyone, and after doing 50 people, only one of them had a 3 of a kind, you would not be impressed. And yet this is what p-hacking is like in real-life research context, where people look at many, many analyses and then just focus on the one that gives them a low probability associated with it, and end up coming to quite wrong conclusions because they interpret a p-value as a measure of how important something is without really understanding you have to look at them in the context of the full data set and the full number of analyses that you've done. Now this was talked about in 1956 by De Groot, and he really talked about it again in terms of games of chance, pointing out that you do need to understand what all the analyses are that you're doing in order to interpret things like p-values, and that this failure to do this was leading to a lot of misunderstood science. And he talked about a failure to distinguish between hypothesis testing, where you go in with a prior hypothesis and then do statistical tests, and exploratory research, where you look at everything in your data and then try to make sense of it. And exploratory research is great, we need it, it's fine, but you can't then apply the sort of inferential statistics that are appropriate for hypothesis testing. So he was really talking about p-hacking, although he didn't use the term. His work never got much publicity because it was in Dutch, but it was translated in 2014 by E.J. Wagenmakers and colleagues, and it's a great paper that I recommend. Harking is hypothesizing after the results are known, talked about by Norbert Kerr, presenting post hoc hypotheses as if they were in fact a priori hypotheses. You look at your data, you not only see something significant buried in amongst all that stuff, but you then think, oh yes, well, the reason that the magician managed to get Dorothy to have a good hand is because she had a particular synergy with that magician. And you start sort of making all sorts of post hoc explanations for why this particular result came out. It's described as a way of translating type 1 errors into theory. And this is often explicitly encouraged by editors and reviewers who say, well, your paper's a bit boring, but if only you did this or changed your hypothesis, it would be much more interesting. So these are the problems that we're dealing with, and that have been around for a very long time, but which I think we're beginning to crack. And I'm going to leave it to Fiona and Chris to talk about really the solutions. But I think the main point I just want to emphasise is that the solution is complex because these problems are not down to just one source. I've talked about them as if they're just the fault of researchers perhaps not being terribly knowledgeable, but we also need to have changes to our incentive structures as well as to the education of people, with journals, funders and institutions changing their behaviour, and that's what UKRN is hoping we can start to bring about. But I will stop talking now and hand you over to Fiona Fidler, and we're really delighted. She's come all the way from Melbourne. She's still deeply jet-lagged, so we hope that the adrenaline kicks in and she feels lively, because it's dreadful giving a talk when you're jet-lagged. But she's heads up an interdisciplinary meta-research group at the University of Melbourne. She's also just recently started working on a DARPA program which is involved in developing machine-driven algorithms for detecting reproducible research. I hope that's an accurate explanation. But please welcome Fiona.
Thanks. I am really very badly jet-lagged, but I'm also ridiculously overexcited to be here, so hopefully this kind of balances out, rather than crashes and burns, but we'll see. So tonight I'm going to talk in terms of two scientific reforms, one that I'll claim kind of largely failed to affect any change and then sort of arguably faded away. And the other I'll claim has been much more successful in affecting changes in practice. And that second one, I'm going to claim has made a big impact, at least a more convincing impact than the first, but I'm not at any stage going to provide any evidence of this. I'm just sort of taking it as a given. But I did just, before I came here, see a new hashtag that might provide some evidence to this. It's SIPS 2019 Space Crisis. So this is the Society for Improving Psychological Science conference that has sold out before even reaching the early bird registration deadline. So clearly, something is going right there. So this reform that I'll claim has been more successful, I'm going to talk about in terms of the credibility revolution that has many other names, the open science movement. It's best understood as a broad response to the replication crisis, and it's received a lot of media attention in the science media, at least over the last 7 or 8 years. And I'm contrasting its relative success with the more narrowly defined statistical reform movement, which is centred around the overuse and misuse of null hypothesis significance testing. So that statistical reform movement begins in psychology in earnest in about the 1960s, though as Dorothy has shown, there are sort of references to it in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s. And though at first, you might think that this statistical reform sounds kind of very narrow and statistical nitpicking around a particular class of tests, I want to assure you that it is far more than that. So, for example, here's Paul Meehl famously describing null hypothesis testing as a terrible mistake, poor scientific strategy, and one of the worst things that ever happened in the history of psychology. And then 2 decades later, this is echoed by Frank Schmidt, claiming that it has systematically retarded the growth of cumulative knowledge. These are not, technical little corrections to your chi-squared test. These critics are questioning fundamental philosophical questions about the nature of scientific practice and scientific progress. And what's notable here, what makes this a sociology of science curiosity, is that there are no defences. Right? So there are no why Meehl is wrong papers or in defence of the status quo papers. Instead, there are literally thousands of papers criticising null hypothesis testing and then just nothing. no debate, no changes to practice. I suppose you might call it sort of passive resistance. With one lonely exception, actually. Does anyone remember this book? This is the one defence of the status quo. It wasn't a big seller. So here I've attempted to kind of map out the territory of these two different reform movements. And in fact, for a long time I didn't actually even see these as distinct movements, but then it became clear that everyone else around me did. And so eventually I've been convinced that they are separate, or at least have some separate components. Now, I apologise in advance if your favourite reform intervention in either of these circles is missing. This isn't a comprehensive list, it's just a quick sort of mapping out. What I was actually looking for was the overlap between them. So there are definitely some common themes here: publication bias, statistical inference, statistical power, misinterpretations and misuse of p-values. And there are other things that also aren't anywhere on here but that would also belong in that overlap space, like concerns about the role of theory in psychological science, for example. So late last night I decided that I would try and map this all out on a timeline. Dorothy's already shown you a very nice timeline, so this is a little bit redundant, but I'm not trying to provide sort of an extensive, complete annotated bibliography. What I'm trying to do is highlight themes from different decades. So in the 1950s, I would characterise these criticisms of null hypothesis testing as largely technical, but really optimistic. So this is where people are offering you advice about the appropriate application of chi-squared tests and such things. By the end of this decade, Sterling has also noticed publication bias and reported publication bias towards statistically significant results at the same level that we see now, 6 decades later. But it's in the 1960s when things turned dark, right? Suddenly the criticisms are not just little optimistic technical corrections, advice about how to do things better. There's a deep, broad pessimism now about whether null hypothesis testing, NHST, the way it's typically practiced, whether this can fulfil the goals of our scientific endeavours, rather than the goals of manufacturing and quality control, where it's come from. And have some things like Jacob Cohen, then doing back calculations of statistical power in the clinical literature and finding alarmingly low rates there. And then in the 1970s, we have a whole decade characterised by developments in meta-analysis. And this brings with it questions about whether NHST is the best facilitator of scientific progress. So there's illusory inconsistencies in the literature created by underpowered research, and we start to see examples of this come out through meta-analytic work, and with Jane Glass's work in psychotherapy, and then with Frank Schmidt and John Hunter's work in industrial and organisational psychology. And some really high-profile critics like Ron Carver start to emerge. And in the 1980s, I think, is the major theme of the 1980s, I would say, is frustration. So this is the point at which people are starting to realise that the then hundreds of articles criticising this practice are not having the desired impact, that change is not happening quickly enough. And Paul Neal says the matter ought to have been settled by now. And we see Settlemyre and Gigerenzer, for example, going back to the clinical literature of the 70s and 80s, looking for any change in statistical power over the time since Cohen did that first survey, and they find there has been no change. The things are still the same. The 1990s is a big decade of editorial and institutional interventions. So 26 journals in total in psychology have some sort of editorial or journal policy change related to de-emphasising statistical significance here, usually trying to put more attention onto effect sizes and confidence intervals, statistical power and clinical or practical significance. And I want to show a couple of these in a little bit more detail. It won't take very long because there's not much to see. So at the start of this decade, in 1993, the then editor of Memory and Cognition, Jeff Loftus, he embarks on what I would consider a relatively ambitious reform. So he wants to replace p-values with figures with error bars, so standard errors or confidence intervals. Or at the very least, he wants to reduce the proportion of papers that only report p-values, that don't give you any effect sizes or confidence intervals. And he says, more often than not, inspection of such a figure with error bars will immediately obviate the necessity for any hypothesis testing procedure. So if you've got this, you don't need any null hypothesis testing. And Loftus has some success, right? So the proportion of articles that only rely on p-values as the only statistic that they give decreases from 53% to 34% during his time as editor. And the figures with error bars rise from 7% to 41%. So that's not nothing. That's not no impact. But Loftus reports, when we interviewed him after this, that he calculated hundreds of those confidence intervals himself. So he managed to get up to 41%, but only by doing the majority of the calculation alone. For authors who couldn't. And when his term ended, business as usual resumed. So within 2 years, the proportion of null hypothesis testing only articles has risen again, and the figures with error bars have dropped. And also there was no transfer of practice to other journals. So what we did was we followed the authors who had published in Memory and Cognition under Loftus's term as editor. We tracked their next articles in other journals to see if the good practices that they'd followed here under Loftus's direction had transferred, and of course they did not. Here's a different reform. This is now the end of the 1990s, the Journal of Clinical and Consulting in Clinical Psychology. Phil Kendall is the editor, and he's not nearly as ambitious here as Loftus was. He just wants this one thing. He just wants authors to make some reference to clinical significance as well as statistical significance. That's it. He makes this editorial statement. He runs a whole special issue in the journal that offers tutorial papers and guidance for how to go about doing this. That's all he wants. And he gets it. Clinical significance reporting rises from 36% to 40%. Not much. And this happens again and again through the 1990s in different journals. There's a little bit of impact and then it falls apart. Or there's no impact to start with. So at the same time, then the APA and the APS are starting to run symposia at their annual conferences where they're talking about banning null hypothesis testing. And then eventually the APA sets up this task force, the Task Force on Statistical Inference. And this is a very high-profile committee that meets twice in person to deliver a report. And then there are plans in place that the statistical recommendations in the APA publication manual will be revised on the basis of the outcome of that report. And this at the time is a very big deal. So there's great optimism about what this committee are going to bring and what kind of impact that changes in the publication manual, which sets the reporting standards for over 1,000 journals, could have. So here are those two things. This is the final task force report, and these are the revision. This is the 5th edition of the manual that came out on the back of that. But of course, the optimism doesn't last very long. So here's Paul Meal again. Paul Meal was one of the 3 external advisors to this task force committee, and after he read the draft report, he said this: "It took 30 years of unanswered criticism before the APA woke up to the fact that there might be a problem here and appointed a committee. But I'm afraid that the APA committee has laboured to bring forth a mouse." He said it reads like a politician's blue ribbon committee report. Has no teeth in it. The APA publication manual itself met with very mixed responses as well. Here's one thing that both the task force report and the APA publication manual were relatively strong on. If they were strong on anything, it was this point about confidence intervals. So the task force report says interval estimates should be given for any effect size, and the publication manual calls them the best reporting strategy. So let's look. Here's a survey of 10 journals in psychology. We surveyed the reporting rate of confidence intervals in these 10 journals before the task force report and the APA publication manual, after the task force report and the APA publication manual, and then at a 2-year follow-up point. And so what did we find? Well, what we found was that after waiting 30 years for this committee to be formed, and so eagerly anticipating changes of the kind that the APA, or the kind of changes and impacts that a revised APA publication manual could have, what we found was that confidence interval reporting increased from 5% of articles to 10% of articles. So let's just step back with me for a minute. So at this point we have thousands, literally thousands of published criticisms of null hypothesis testing, virtually no defences. We've had editorial interventions in 26 journals, high-profile critics, committees, task forces, institutional intervention. And what we get from that are changes in reporting that go from 5 to 10%, or little changes that can be detected while one editor is doing calculations for people and then revert when that editor leaves. How is this possible? This is a book, some of you might remember. This is Michael Oakes' book that came out in 1986. It's a great book. It's out of print, unfortunately, but he asks this question, right? He says, if one accepts these criticisms of null hypothesis testing, then it would appear that psychologists and other behavioural and social scientists have, for the last 40 years or so, been almost willfully stupid. Now, we don't believe this is true. Michael Oakes doesn't. I don't believe this is true, and Oakes doesn't believe this is true either, which is why he says, ask this next question, which is, what other explanations can be offered for their failure to acknowledge at a much earlier date the cogency of these arguments? So by the end of the 1990s, I was consumed by this question. I'd left psychology and taken refuge in a philosophy of science department, and I was madly working and writing about institutional inertia, about the seductive power of probabilistic fallacies and how they've led us astray and led to the neglect of statistical power, about statistics being used as rhetorical devices instead of reasoned argument and evidence, and about the role of ethics in statistical practice. And I think these are all, very sensible things to do and to think about, but they're no good as explanations of the wonderment. For example, none of them could explain why, even at the time that this was happening, that some disciplines like medicine were making more progress in achieving these reforms than other disciplines like psychology and ecology. It's not because medical researchers are less prone to probabilistic fallacies or more resistant to institutional inertia. They're not real explanations. And what's interesting to me now is revisiting revisiting this question really in light of the current more successful credibility revolution, which I've stuck here on the end of this now very overcrowded timeline. So I guess the question that I'm preoccupied with now is this one. Why now and not then? And I have 5 answers to this question, but don't worry, they're short answers. So the first one is about community and connectedness. Right? So some people think that, this kind of just boils down to social media, but I do believe that it's a bit bigger than that. So the statistical reform advocates, that I was interviewing during my PhD, like 16, 18 years ago, they were really very largely disconnected from each other. So, for example, Robert Rosenthal and Jacob Cohen didn't even meet until 1994, despite having spent 3 decades basically writing parallel arguments and living just a few hours away from each other. The OPA task force met twice for a total of 6 hours in airport conference lounges. So I think these reform advocates were isolated in ways that it's hard for us to understand, even just this short period of time later. And the demographics were very different too. So the reform advocates that I've talked about, so Robert Rosenthal, Paul Meehl, Jacob Cohen, these are senior, older, very established men. It's hard to imagine a more different demographic than the one that constitutes the current credibility revolution that's driven by early career researchers, that's incredibly more diverse and internationally representative. We have new societies too, and new networks like this one. We even have one in Australia. And of course we have Twitter. Another explanation, I think, is about coordination and cooperation. So the 26 journal policy changes that I talked about were all very disconnected. Very few even referenced or acknowledged that the others had happened. They're all sort of piecemeal. Medicine fared much better than psychology during that time, actually, largely because of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which set uniform requirements for journals that were signatories to that committee. So there was a lot more coordination there, and there was a lot more change there too in those days. But even medicine in the 80s and 90s, I think, had nothing compared to what's going on now, the level of coordinated activity that we see in the top guidelines, in open science badges, and in new journal formats like registered reports that are being rolled out across many journals at once. Technology, but maybe not how you might think. I say that because it's very common to want to attribute advances in statistical methods to increases in computational power, but it's important to remember, the sort of reforms that these advocates were calling for in the 80s and 90s was about reporting confidence intervals instead of p-values. They didn't fail because of a lack of technological developments or computational power. That wasn't the explanation. But obviously, technology has been necessary for parts of this current revolution, that it matters to the ability to share data and code, to be open, and it matters to accessing education and information outside of one's own institution. There's something different about the demonstrability of the problem now too. So those earlier criticisms, the statistical reform criticisms, they're all very logically sound and they were very clear. But they were kind of, in a sense they were abstract. Comments on statistical theory or comments on philosophy of science. And what's happened, I think, since 2011 is that the nature of the problem we're dealing with has drastically increased on this kind of dimension of demonstrability, that we now have so many empirical demonstrations of the consequences of these problems that it's hard to ignore. And then finally, say something about sort of framing or understanding behaviour change challenges. To be honest, I don't really quite have the language to talk about this, the right language to talk about this fifth explanation here, but I guess what I'm trying to describe is some sort of shift from grumpy old men yelling about statistics to this understanding of scientific workflow, of structures and incentives and support. Okay. So here are my 5 explanations altogether, but I think it still feels like a bit of an unsatisfying list. And so if you want to add any of your own explanations, please do. I'm about to finish up, but I just want to say one thing about this sentiment. Do you hear this? I hear this a lot. No, but revolutions take time. That change is coming, but these things, they just take time. And then maybe it'll be followed with some sort of reference to Kuhn and paradigm shifts and waiting for an older generation to die. Well, look at this, right? So we know that there was a probabilistic revolution that hit the sciences sort of post-World War II, and null hypothesis testing was at the forefront of that probabilistic revolution for life and social sciences. But look at this. Look how quickly it took psychology compared to these other disciplines, compared to medicine and psychology. By 1950, it was in 2/3 of articles. So maybe revolutions take time, but some seem to take more time than others.
Right, thanks Fiona. Let me just find my slides here. So Fiona talked about the past, and I'm going to talk about the future. That was really interesting, hearing about all that history. So much I don't know about that. Fiona asked, will this time be different? And I guess my argument I'm going to make to you this evening is that one initiative in particular, Registered Reports, shows that it's already different. And I'm going to explain tonight why I think that is, and hopefully I'll convince you of that fact. So why are we here? Fiona gives a really nice explanation for the history of basically nothing happening. And if you look at the APA in particular, it's an organisation that excels in doing not very much. And I think we have to take a fairly frank look at why we're here. And when I do this in workshops that I teach particularly to early career researchers, I ask them 2 questions only. Which part of a research study do you believe should be beyond your control as a scientist? I put this to the audience of scientists. And the answer they always come back with is the results. Every scientist should feel that they're at some distance from the results they produce as an objective investigator. Then I ask them, which part of a research study do you believe is most important for advancing your career and publishing in top journals? And then they say, oh, that's the results as well. So we're taught from a very young age, pretty much from in psychology and many other sciences, that on the one hand, to be a good scientist, don't touch results. Let results be the results. That's what an objective investigator does. But on the other hand, if you want to be a successful scientist, make sure they're amazing. It's a bit of a contradiction. And what this does, as Fiona alluded to, is it throws the incentives out of whack in academia. It puts quality in competition with success. And this is quite fatal. Because on the one hand, what we would all agree as a community is that in terms of advancing knowledge and scientific progress, the most important thing is that high quality research is published regardless of the results, regardless of the outcome. But on the other hand, what's best for individual scientists, what's best for me in having a successful career is producing a lot of great results. And this is quite fatal to the scientific method. So here we have an idealization of the deductive scientific method in which we begin by specifying our theory and predictions. We design a study, we collect our data, we analyze that data, we interpret, and we do more research. If you put a scientist under pressure, institutional pressure, personal pressure, professional pressure, to produce great results, they will do it, and they will do it by doing this. Every single point in this cycle breaks if you put it under pressure to get results. Whether it's lack of replication, small studies, low power. We've known that low power has been a problem for 60 years. Nothing's changed. Whether it's selectively reporting from complex data sets the results which are most impressive and likely to get us published. Whether it's changing our hypothesis to fit results that were in fact unexpected, but helps us tell a good story if we do reframe our rationale, or whether it's censoring entirely certain kinds of results from the literature, publication bias. And when you look at this problem, I think you end up really with one major solution. And for me, that is making results a dead currency. The only way we'll get out of this hole, in my opinion, is to take the pressure to get great results and eradicate it as much as possible. So when we're thinking about evaluating the quality of science and of scientists, we must, as much as possible, devalue the results that are produced from research. And that might sound kind of crazy. I mean, research is all about generating results, right? Isn't that why we're here? Otherwise we're theorists, we're not empiricists. But it turns out that if you base the judgment of quality on the results, all you do is favour bias. And it's from this philosophy that registered reports emerged in 2013. And what we did is we took the peer review process and we just modified it in one simple way, which is that normally, as many of you will know, when you submit an article for publication in a journal, you do so after you've completed your research. But with a registered report, we changed that process into a two-stage mechanism, where at the first stage, reviewers assess protocols before research has been undertaken, they assess the importance of the research question, they judge the rigour and the robustness of the methodology. If this passes muster, then the journal offers what we call in-principle acceptance. So basically accepting the final product regardless of the outcome, regardless of the main results. And then after the researchers do the science, they come back with a completed study, a completed manuscript. Reviewers now have done most of the work. We're not relitigating all of that stuff again, but now they're assessing, did the authors do what they said they would, and are the conclusions they're drawing based upon the evidence. This has two real main advantages, two sets of advantages, I should say. One for the community. So what we're basically doing here is we're taking results out of the equation. So when a manuscript comes in at stage one, it is assessed purely based on the quality of the theory and the methodology, and the results are irrelevant to that decision. So it's the only way of being absolutely sure that we've eliminated the biases for publishing certain kinds of results by making those decisions before results exist. But it also aligns the incentive for the individual. Because now, as an author, I get peer review when it's most useful to me, not after I've done my research, and reviewers can pick holes in my methodology. But whilst I'm still designing my study, I can integrate that expert feedback. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of my own stress levels as a researcher, I can now do my research safe in the knowledge that once I get my IPA, my in-principle acceptance, my paper will not be rejected based upon those main results. Now, since we launched this 6 years ago, it's now been adopted by 165 journals to date. And it's been nice to see an initiative which began within psychology and in cognitive neuroscience, my own field, adopted across quite a wide range of areas. So we're seeing it taken up in the life and medical sciences, ranging from preclinical all the way through to clinical medicine, a range of social sciences, and even in the physical sciences. And that rate of adoption is exponential. So at the moment, 165. At the end of last year, it was just over 120. This is going to continue to increase in the years ahead. And the number of published registered reports is also growing. There's now more than 150 such stage 2 submissions, and we can expect to see a lot more as they come through the pipeline. Now you might ask, are these actually doing what we would hope they would do? Are registered reports working as intended? And it's early days, and the results I'm going to show you now are quite provisional. But so far, they appear to be doing what we expect. So when we eliminate the pressure to get great results, we would expect that the bias that researchers use in many cases to produce favourable results will reduce, and therefore we're going to find out that our predictions are in fact more wrong than we realise, or we believe at the outset. This chart shows one of the first analyses of the hypotheses, the predictions that were included in registered reports, and we find that in registered report articles that are completed all the way through to the end, there's around about a 3 to 4 times increase in the likelihood of those hypotheses being disconfirmed. So we're finding out, as we would expect, that we're wrong more often than we think when we eliminate the bias against publishing certain kinds of results over others. So essentially this is early evidence that we are in fact avoiding fooling ourselves more often with this format. And the second critical indicator for many scientists is, are these being read? Are these articles actually having an immediate impact on the field? And we can say that yes, we're finding out that we're wrong, which means that there's a lot more negative and null results being published, but they're also being read. And we know this because they're being cited, and they're being cited at around the rate of a regular article, or in fact possibly higher. So before I wrap up, I'd just like to outline the future of this initiative. This is the present, really, but it's evolving at such a pace that we need to be thinking about what's coming next. And there's 4 particular goals that I have, and many of us have who are working on this program. The first is that you may have noticed a similarity between registered reports and grant review. Both involve the assessment and review of a proposal before research is undertaken. And so there's an idea, a proposal for registered reports research grants, or RRGs. These are where a registered report submission actually doubles as a funding bid. It is assessed by the funder and the journal at the same time. If they both approve of the content, then the researcher gets their funding and their journal acceptance at more or less the same time. I thought this was a great idea. Marcus Manafo has been instrumental in driving this forward, as has Salvo LaRosa, if he's here. Is he in the audience tonight? We've got a number of journals and a number of funders partnering up now to create these initiatives. So links between journals on the left and funders on the right. So these are groups which are not typically associated with each other. They don't tend to work together in this way. But we're finding that this approach is very complementary with their goals. The second major goal we have is to continue monitoring the implementation and the impact of registered reports. So we really need meta-scientists to assemble on this. So the meta-science is the science of science. It's understanding what goes wrong in science, what can we improve in science, and improving scientific practice. And we need to be keeping a close eye, as I know some of you in the audience are tonight, on how registered reports differ from regular research articles. Are they working as intended? How can we make them stronger? How can we optimize their implementation? And what are the wider impacts on culture? So once a journal starts offering this format, does it change its practices in a more fundamental way? We heard from Fiona how weak source recommendations from the APA had very little effect, but perhaps offering a registered reports format within a journal might have a more powerful effect on raising standards within that journal. We don't know. The third goal, I think, is to actually use this as a vehicle for reinventing the concept of the research article itself. I mean, we really deal with 17th century technology when it comes to publishing papers. Most registered reports that I see as editor, they're prepared in Microsoft Word. The predictions are often vague, at least initially, before we attack them as editors and reviewers. And there's often insufficient links between the components that make up an important study and make up the essential ingredients for eliminating bias. So linking predictions with theory, with sampling plans, with analyses. And I think the future will be to change the whole way this thing is constructed from the ground up and actually use modular software or apps to build registered reports using their key components. So building a hypothesis and an analysis plan together using some kind of software which ensures that the links are strong from the beginning, building in computational reproducibility, so building in R scripts, simulations, preparatory steps which can assure us that anyone else could reproduce those particular analysis or methodological steps, and also building in machine readability so that meta-analysts in the future can analyse these formats efficiently. And the fourth goal I would put to you is that registered reports are not being proposed as a mandatory approach in science. I'm not suggesting, and no one is suggesting, that this should be the only way to publish research, but I am suggesting that it should be a universal option at all reputable empirical journals. So wherever a journal publishes hypothesis-driven science, I would like to see a registered report option for authors if they so choose to use it. And I would go one step further and put it to you that in some contexts there is an argument that registered reports should be mandatory, and that particular context, in my opinion, is clinical trials, where I don't see any excuse for taking any other approach, frankly. I'll leave you with this page, which highlights the information hub on registered reports, where you can go to find a list of all the journals, lots and lots of other information we've got there. We're constantly adding to it, and you can find my slides there. But otherwise, actually, I'd like to thank Fiona personally for such a great talk. It was really fascinating, and I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening to our lecture. Thank you.
So we will have time for some questions, and maybe we can arrange some chairs in a slightly ad hoc way so that our speakers can be here. But before we do, I do want to say a couple of things about UKRN, which is why this public lecture has been convened, why we've been able to invite Fiona over here. First of all, why are you hearing from so many psychologists? Because there certainly isn't a problem that's unique to psychology. I guess I would say that. I'm a psychologist. But that's not me being defensive. I think at the heart of this, the issue is that science is done by humans. And the issue is one of humans responding to incentives, often unconsciously. And what we're trying to do is bring about behaviour change. So perhaps it makes sense that psychologists have been quite vocal in introducing some of these initiatives that we've been talking about and hearing about. The problem is one of culture, ultimately. And there's a great quote that many of you will know, which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That you can have these grand plans for bringing about institutional change, and when they hit the reality of how people actually work in terms of the deep unspoken cultures that shape our behaviour on a daily basis, that strategy can fall apart very quickly. So how do we change it? Well, as we've heard about, we need to, this is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but we need to think about systems. We need to think about the interconnectedness of the problem, the fact that you have all of these different moving parts, and if you change one thing, the rest of the system is going to compensate for that, and actually the net change will be far less than you might think, which might explain some of the failure of the 50 years of criticism of null hypothesis significance testing to get anywhere. And I think it's right that what's different now is cooperation, coordination, and the fact that there's a now groundswell of interest at all levels, from early career researchers all the way up to funders, to actually bring about change. And one of the great things I think about UKRN is, first of all, the amount of support that we've received from funders. We have now, I think, 15 or so different fund holders, publishers, learned societies, other stakeholders like JISC, who are supporting us either directly through financial contributions or in kind, which allows us to do things like this and bring people together. But we also have representatives, local network leads, at over 40 institutions across the UK now. So there's a groundswell of support at the grassroots level that's supported by this higher level, top-down interest in actually improving the culture of science. And what's interesting about that, I think, is that whilst we're focusing on reproducibility and the quality of the work that we produce, fundamentally what we're trying to do is make science better and make the culture of science better. And that then links to other current debates around diversity, around bullying and harassment, how we can make the scientific culture a healthier, better place, not just in terms of improving the outputs that we generate, but improving the quality of the environment that we all work within. So I think those things link together in a very interesting way. And it's really exciting to be involved in something that just is generating so much excitement at so many different levels. And I'm extremely grateful for all of the support we've received from early career researchers, from funders, from publishers, from institutions. It's been really overwhelming how fast things have moved. And that brings me to the final point, which is Fiona asked, do revolutions have to happen slowly? And there's another great quote, which is that revolutions do happen slowly until they happen all at once. And it feels like this one is now at the point where it's happening all at once. Any questions? Yeah.
Thanks for this fascinating evening. I think there's a bit of a compound here between, for example, showing confidence intervals when one's reporting data, which kind of is a massive thing, I think, has to step forward, and getting too bogged down in academic journals. Because I think they're just sort of archaic leftover from the days when publishing was really expensive, if on paper. So you had to have a lot of architecture to pull it off. Now, quite frankly, preprints are online, they cost nothing, and it kind of makes a possibility that we could just have a sort of free-for-all where you get peer reviewing and people just pile in on your preprint. And in many ways that could be quite interesting. What would you say?
Would either of you like to take that?
I mean, that's what physics does already, so we can see that future already. But you have to get there. Because at the moment, if you're an early career researcher in the life sciences and you think you can build a career on preprints, you won't get a job.
That sounds like sort of perverse incentive to me.
Of course it is, yeah. But
shouldn't we be attacking that?
we should, and I think the way you do that is systematically. So you have to say, all right. And we had a very interesting discussion today about ways of, in a meeting we had, about ways of building registered reports formats that are separate from journals entirely. And I think you can do this, but you have to create stepping stones for academics to follow, particularly early career scientists, because they're not going to. Nothing ever changes suddenly, and I think it's important in the spirit of what you were saying, that the community, particularly the junior research community, moves with us on this, and it's not seen as too top down. But I don't think anyone in this room would disagree with the idea that we can achieve an awful lot using preprints and our own review system separately from journals and publishers. I think that's a bit of a no-brainer.
But it's an interesting example, I think, of why we need to think in a systems framework, if you like, because what we could conceive of in the future is a system whereby we have the component parts of a study, the study protocol, the data, whether they be qualitative data or quantitative data. This is not something that is restricted to a particular subset of the academic enterprise, if you like. And all of those component parts are archived on an institutional repository. The problem with moving straight to preprint is that you then have this huge bandwidth problem. How do you filter all of that information and identify what it is that you need to look at? So you could conceive of a future where you have all of those component parts publicly available that don't have to go through the gatekeeper of a journal, but what the journals do is provide some kind of digest service where they then look for what professional editors might consider to be high quality work. I'm not saying that's necessarily a solution, but we need to have a vision of where we want to get to and how we get to there from where we are at the moment.
I think the digest thing's called Twitter, isn't it?
Well, it could be, absolutely. I mean, we're in the middle of a big natural experiment at the moment where people are trying lots of different things, and we'll see what sticks. And I think we have to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We might end up with VHS rather than Betamax because it's what everyone uses and what everyone adopts. But if it's better than where we are at the moment, then that's still a step in the right direction. Yeah.
I think that one of the core problems is that in science, there are so many people that are not doing science anymore or science, that they're more interested in fame and money than true science. And not even the universities are only interested in science. They're more concerned about the next rep than good, qualitatively good science. And I agree with you that the pre-report could actually be just the grant application, right? Why not? Because the grant application is not anymore what we really want to do. It's a selling product. It's what do I have to say so I get the money for something else that I want to do. And I think that's a core problem. And you say that a target audience would be young investigators, but they don't have any or not many role models to follow, because there's so many scientists which are at the moment in power which do not really care about high quality science. So where can young investigators learn how to do proper science?
I mean, I think that's precisely the problem that these interventions are trying to address.
Yes, but
I think that's
In terms of role models, I would say the social media was mentioned earlier, and I think any young researcher should be on there, because I've learned a huge amount over the last 5 years from just interacting with people I never would have interacted with before. I mean, you mentioned, what was it, Rosenthal never met? That's crazy. I think there's a huge network out there to be had and to be explored, and there's connections to be built. And the other thing we've learned, I think, over the last few years is those connections can be politically very effective. I think every young scientist has a moment where they feel if they're pushing the reform agenda on their own, they can feel quite isolated and unsupported until they realise that actually there's a world out there of other early career scientists in the same position who can work together to achieve goals, and they have done so very effectively. Some of them are in this audience tonight. So look beyond your immediate horizons, is what I would say. And to your first point about registered reports and grants, yes, I think there is a certain clarity that you get from pre-specifying and committing to a certain program of work, both with a funder and a journal. What I would say, the caveat I would add to that is that this won't work for all types of research funding, because I think we have to create a space for the more freewheeling exploratory science, which is what I think a lot of research grants actually are now, but pretending to be something else, because that's what funders expect, or at least that's what funders think scientists are capable of producing. So I would say that, within a certain restricted zone, it could be a very effective model for the future.
This, I think, is one of the reasons why we need to change culture as well, because at the moment, we still have this Victorian culture of, esteemed scientists who have acolytes around them, if you like, and we recruit people to senior positions on the basis of being great scientists, not necessarily on being great role models, great leaders, and so on. So changing the culture will hopefully help with that. We have time for one more question, which we'll have from another member of our advisory board.
And a bit in line with this sort of maybe pessimistic view, I'm often thinking, what if, so we have this fledgling movement now, everybody's very excited, and I'm very excited too. But if you look at the numbers of published registered reports, pre-registrations and so on, they are still very small compared to all of the research that's being done. And I think, and you've already sort of mentioned this, the sort of incentive structure is still largely unchanged in most places. So what determines that people get hired, that people get promoted? There's still old criteria that will favor people who can churn out a lot of research in little time, so invest less effort. And what we are asking here from people is more effort, basically, right? There's not a lot of way of getting around this, especially as Fiona said in the statistical parts, like you need people to understand statistics better and like invest more in learning these things, for example. So what if all of the people who picked it up so far have an evolutionary disadvantage and we'll all die out because we will be less likely to be promoted. Our PhD students will be less likely to stay in research. The PhD students who've discovered this themselves are so disillusioned by their PIs that they have
Run
so
away to philosophy.
yeah, they just exactly. So what do we do about that?
I would agree with that if we were just telling people to do better science without giving them any incentive to do it. But don't forget, I mean, with a registered report, you get your article accepted before you even start your research. I mean, isn't that the best incentive? Isn't that the best reward you give anyone for doing robust science?
The other part that's changed, though, this is where I think structures like UKRN come in, which have the buy-in of UKRI and Research England and Wellcome and MRC and ESRC and NERC and AHRC and so on. I'm going to speak to the University of Bristol senior management team in a couple of weeks to talk about reforming our promotion and hiring practices to take these kinds of things into account. If you start to incentivise these things through promotion and hiring practices, then that starts to shift the needle, I think. And it's not the only solution, but I think that's part of it as well. That's why you need the top-down part as well. It can't just be grassroots. Because I think the grassroots part will put individuals at a disadvantage if we're not careful, although perhaps not to the degree that people might fear. But nevertheless, it's a valid concern. But what you need is that top-down part as well that changes the incentive structures that people are working within. We will have a final question. I know, but Courtney did ask. We'll have one more very short.
A note of optimism on the top-down. I'm on the REP panel. The REP is really interested in this, and they want to recognise reproducibility is one of their criteria for rigour. And once it gets into the REP, then it starts to make big changes. I mean, that's why we have open access, right?
Absolutely.
It started out a few years ago, now it is a requirement. We're testing the waters in this REP. Eventually it will be a requirement, because the REP actually is interested in promoting good science.
And
it's interpreted by universities, different question, but the REP does want to promote good.
And Research England is one of our stakeholders in this support.
Exactly, so the incentive structures will change.
Exactly. I am in trouble for running over. The speakers will be around over the drinks outside. You can ask questions directly. Oh, there we go.
To get to the drinks, important information, it's in the reception room in Henriette Raphael House, which is, you go out of the building, really across the quad.